The air in the lawyer's office was thick with the scent of old paper and stale grief. Eleanor sat stiffly on a leather chair that felt far too large for her, the silence pressing down as heavily as the oppressive humidity of the August afternoon. Across from her, her brothers, Liam and Daniel, were the picture of somber respectability in their dark suits. But Eleanor could see the impatience flickering in their eyes. They had places to be, lives that hadn't paused just because their father, Thomas, had finally succumbed to the illness that had shadowed their family for years. Eleanor's own grief was a quiet, hollow thing. It felt less like a storm and more like a vast, empty room inside her chest. For the last 5 years, her life had revolved around her father's needs. The endless cycle of appointments, medications, and quiet, watchful nights had become her reality. While Liam was busy climbing the corporate ladder and Daniel was expanding his real estate portfolio, Eleanor was the one holding Thomas's hand, reading to him when his eyes grew tired, and listening to the same stories from his youth, told over and over as his world shrank to the 4 walls of his bedroom. Mr. Abernathy, the family lawyer for as long as Eleanor could remember, cleared his throat. He was a kind man, with a gentle face that seemed ill-suited to the grim business of last wills and testaments. He polished his spectacles with a handkerchief, his movements slow and deliberate. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice a low murmur. Thomas was a man of particular wishes. He was very clear about how he wanted his estate to be managed. Liam shifted in his seat, his polished shoe tapping a silent, rhythmic beat against the Persian rug. "Let's get on with it, Abernathy. We all know what it's going to say. Dad was traditional. Split 3 ways, minus your fees, of course." Daniel chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Don't be so crass, Liam. At least pretend to be sad." The corner of his mouth twitched into a smirk that he quickly tried to hide. Eleanor said nothing. She simply watched the lawyer's hands as he unfolded the thick document. The crackle of the paper was the loudest sound in the room. Mr. Abernathy began to read. He detailed the smaller bequests first: a donation to the local library, a vintage watch for a cousin, the usual pleasantries of a life well lived and neatly concluded. Eleanor felt a knot tightening in her stomach. She stared at a water stain on the ceiling, tracing its edges with her eyes, dissociating from the sterile legal language that was dissecting her father's life into assets and liabilities. Then came the main part of the estate. "To my eldest son, Liam," Mr. Abernathy read, "I bequeath my entire stock portfolio and the sum of $500,000. Liam's mask of detached solemnity slipped. A look of pure, unadulterated triumph flashed across his face before he smoothed it away. He glanced at Daniel, who gave him a subtle nod of acknowledgement. "To my son, Daniel," the lawyer continued, "I bequeath the family home located at 212 Oak Street, along with all its contents, and the remainder of my savings, totaling approximately $500,000. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his lips. He caught Eleanor's eye and gave her a look that was a mixture of pity and condescension. It was the same look he'd given her for years, the one that said, "Poor, simple Eleanor. What would you do without us?" Eleanor held her breath, waiting. There had to be something, a mention, a token. Her name. Mr. Abernathy kept reading, his voice droning on about trusts and tax provisions. He folded the final page. And then, he stopped. He looked up, his gaze lingering on Eleanor with an expression of profound discomfort. Silence. It was Daniel who broke it. "Is that it?" he asked, his voice laced with mock confusion. He looked from the lawyer to his sister. "What about Eleanor? Did he leave her his collection of worn-out sweaters?" Liam joined in, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "Oh, come on, Dad must have left her something. Maybe the satisfaction of a job well done. You were a great nurse, Ellie. Really top-notch." The laughter started as a low snort from Daniel, and Liam quickly joined in. It wasn't loud, raucous laughter. It was worse. It was quiet, contained, and utterly contemptuous. It was the sound of her entire life, her sacrifices, being reduced to a punchline. They were mocking her, openly. The years of selfless care, the career she'd put on hold, the relationships she'd let wither, all of it was being erased in a wave of their smug amusement. The heat of humiliation crept up Eleanor's neck, hot and prickly. She felt small, invisible, like a ghost in her own life story. Her father, the man she had dedicated herself to, had not only forgotten her, he had actively erased her. He had left her with nothing but the echoes of her brother's scorn. She squeezed her hands together in her lap, her knuckles turning white, praying for the floor to open up and swallow her. Mr. Abernathy held up a hand, his expression suddenly stern. "Gentlemen, that is quite enough." His voice cut through their laughter, sharp and authoritative. He let the silence hang for a moment, his disappointed gaze sweeping over the two brothers before settling once again on Eleanor. His look had softened, now holding a flicker of something else, something like anticipation. "The reading of the main will," he said slowly, deliberately, "is concluded." However, Thomas left one final item, a personal addendum, to be presented only after the primary bequests were made clear. He reached beside his chair and lifted a small, plain wooden box. "And," he added, placing it on the desk with a soft thud, "he left this video." Liam and Daniel exchanged a look of bewildered irritation. The smug satisfaction drained from their faces, replaced by a guarded curiosity. "A video?" Liam scoffed, breaking the tense silence. "What is this? Some sort of theatric final performance?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Dad was always a bit of a sentimentalist, but this is ridiculous. Abernathy, we're busy men. If there's nothing else of substance—" "I assure you, Liam, this is of the utmost substance," Mr. Abernathy said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned his attention to the polished mahogany credenza behind his desk, produced a laptop, and placed it on the desk facing the three siblings. His movements were unhurried, each click of the laptop's latch and whir of its startup sequence, amplifying the tension in the room. Eleanor remained silent, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't dare to hope. Hope had been a dangerous thing for her, a fragile bird that never seemed to survive the winter of her reality. Yet, she couldn't tear her eyes from the screen. A video. Her father had left a message. He hadn't just faded away into silence. He had something left to say. The lawyer inserted a small USB stick. A moment later, a video file appeared on the screen. He clicked it, and the screen filled with their father's face. The sight was a jolt. Thomas wasn't the frail, bedridden man from his final days. This version of him was thinner, yes, and pale, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He was sitting up in a hospital bed, the sterile white of the sheets contrasting with the determined set of his jaw. The date stamp in the corner of the video read exactly 1 year ago, the day before the major surgery that everyone had hoped would be a turning point, but had instead marked the beginning of his final decline. Thomas looked directly into the camera, as if he could see them, right there in the office. "Hello, children," he began, his voice raspy but firm. There was no preamble, no gentle easing in. "If you are watching this, it means I am gone, and Mr. Abernathy has just read my first will. I imagine right about now 2 of you are feeling quite pleased with yourselves. And Eleanor, I imagine you are feeling heartbroken. And for that, my sweet girl, I am so, so sorry. Please just listen." He paused, taking a slow, deliberate breath. A man who knows his time is short sees the world differently. The noise fades away, and the truth becomes startlingly clear. For the past 5 years, my world has been small, but my daughter, Eleanor, has filled it with a light I thought I had lost forever. She put her life on hold, not because I asked her to, but because her heart is forged from a love so pure it humbles me. Eleanor felt a sob catch in her throat. Tears blurred her father's image on the screen. This was the validation she never knew she needed, a testament to her sacrifice spoken from beyond the grave. Thomas then turned his gaze slightly, as if looking from one son to the other. "Liam, Daniel, I have always been proud of your ambition. The successful businesses, the beautiful homes. You built empires. But while you were building, you forgot to visit. You forgot that the foundation of this family wasn't money, but time. Love, presence." Liam shifted uncomfortably. Daniel stared at the screen, his jaw clenched. "I wasn't always asleep when you visited," Thomas continued, his voice growing colder. "I heard the whispers. A burden. How long do we have to keep this up? I heard you discussing this house, my home, not as a place of memories, but as an asset, an inconvenience on your balance sheets. You measured my final years in dollars and cents." The air in the office turned to ice. The brothers' faces were pale masks of shock and dawning horror. "I had to know the truth," their father said, his voice softening again as he looked back to the center of the camera, back to Eleanor. "I had to know what was truly in your hearts. So I created a test. The will that was just read, it was a mirror. I held it up to see who my sons had truly become when they thought no one of consequence was watching. I am grieved to say, you showed me." He coughed, a dry, painful sound that made Eleanor flinch. But a father's love is a stubborn thing. It hopes for the best, but it also prepares for the worst. My true legacy is not in stocks or properties. It is in the values I tried to instill: empathy, integrity, and caring for those who have cared for you." He looked down for a moment, gathering his strength. When he looked up again, his eyes were filled with a fierce, protective love. "The first will is a fiction, a necessary cruelty, and for the pain it caused you, Eleanor, I will spend eternity asking for your forgiveness. But I did it to protect you, to ensure that your future would be in your hands, not at the mercy of your brother's fleeting generosity." He then looked past the camera, as if speaking to someone in the room with him. "Mr. Abernathy, you have been a loyal friend. You know what to do." The video ended, plunging the screen and the room into a sudden, deafening silence. Liam and Daniel were frozen, their faces a mixture of fury and disbelief. "This is insane!" Liam finally exploded, leaping to his feet. "He was medicated. He wasn't of sound mind. We'll contest this." Mr. Abernathy simply ignored him. He calmly reached for the plain wooden box on his desk. He unlocked it with a small, ornate key. The click of the lock echoed like a gunshot in the still air. He lifted the lid and from inside pulled out a second, thicker document, bound in a dark blue ribbon. "This," the lawyer announced to the stunned room, "is the true and final will and testament of Thomas Albright." The sight of the second will, bound and sealed, seemed to suck the very air from Liam's lungs. He sank back into his chair, his face a pallid shade of gray. Daniel, for his part, was motionless, his eyes fixed on the document with a look of pure, venomous hatred. The smug, condescending pity he had shown Eleanor just minutes before had curdled into raw fury. The room had become a pressure cooker, and Mr. Abernathy was calmly turning up the heat. The lawyer untied the blue ribbon with the same methodical care he'd shown before. He flattened the pages on his desk. The paper was crisp, the ink a bold, confident black. It felt more real, more final than the document that had preceded it. "As per Thomas's recorded instructions," Mr. Abernathy stated, his voice steady and clear, "the previous document is hereby rendered null and void. This is the legally binding testament." He didn't look at the brothers. His focus was entirely on the text, as if they were nothing more than furniture in the room. "I will begin with bequests to my sons, Liam and Daniel," he announced. Eleanor braced herself. Even after the video, a part of her expected a simple reversal, a three-way split as originally anticipated. She still couldn't fathom the depth of her father's plan. "To my son Liam," Mr. Abernathy read, "whose ambition I once admired, I leave a single framed photograph of the first small office I ever rented. It is a reminder that every great enterprise begins with humility and hard work, not just a hunger for the finish line. May it help you remember the man I tried to be, not just the assets I accumulated." He paused. Liam stared, speechless. A photograph. His inheritance was a photograph. "And to my son Daniel," the lawyer continued, his voice unwavering, "who so admired the roof over my head, I leave my collection of gardening tools and the keys to the community garden plot I maintained for 15 years. It is a reminder that a home is not just wood and brick, but something you must nurture with your own hands for it to grow. May you learn the value of tending to something other than your own portfolio." The silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of utter devastation. Daniel let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound devoid of any humor. It was the sound of a string snapping. "Gardening tools?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "He left me his shovels? Is this a joke?" "Your father was not joking," Mr. Abernathy said coolly, not looking up. He then turned a page, and his voice softened. He was now at the heart of the will. "And now," he said, looking directly at Eleanor for the first time since the video played, his eyes filled with a gentle warmth, "for the remainder of my estate." He read from the document, but the words were clearly her father's. "To my daughter, Eleanor, my light, my rock, my fiercest protector. To you I leave everything else. The house at 2112 Oak Street with all its contents, my entire stock portfolio, the entirety of my savings, all of it. I do not give you this wealth as a reward, my sweet girl. A reward implies a transaction, and your love has never been transactional. It is a gift freely given, and I can only answer it in kind." Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth, a gasp escaping. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. It wasn't the money, the number of zeros that would now be attached to her name. It was the words. My light, my rock, my fiercest protector. Her father had seen her. He had seen all of it. Every lonely night, every canceled plan, every quiet sacrifice. He had seen it, and named it love. Mr. Abernathy continued reading Thomas's words. I know your brothers will call me a fool. They will say I was manipulated. They will say you do not have the head for business to manage such an inheritance. They have always underestimated you, Eleanor, because they measure strength in noise and aggression. They never understood that true strength is quiet, steadfast, and unwavering. It is the strength to show up, day after day. You have that strength in abundance. This inheritance is not a burden. It is your freedom. It is the capital to restart your life, to build your own dreams, to travel, to study, to do whatever your heart desires, without asking anyone for permission. You have earned it, not in these past 5 years, but in every moment you chose kindness when the world showed you none. The final sentence hung in the air, a benediction and a final, loving farewell. The spell was broken by the scrape of a chair. Liam was on his feet again, his face a mask of purple rage. This is a farce, he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Eleanor. She poisoned him against us. She was with him every day, whispering in his ear, playing the martyr. And you? He snarled, turning on the lawyer. You let this happen. We will see you in court. We'll drain every last cent of this so-called inheritance in legal fees before she sees a dime. Daniel stood up as well, his movements slower, more menacing. He didn't shout. His voice was a low, dangerous growl. You'll regret this, Eleanor. You may have the money for now, but you're still alone. And you always will be. Money can't buy a family. The hypocrisy of his words was staggering, but Eleanor barely heard him. His threat felt hollow, distant. For years she had been afraid of being alone. But in that moment, she realized she already had been. Her loneliness had been a crowded room, filled with the ghosts of her brother's expectations and the weight of their judgment. The solitude that now stretched before her felt different. It felt like peace. It felt like an open door. She met her brother's furious gaze, and for the first time in her life, she felt no fear. No need to placate him, to shrink herself to make him feel bigger. She simply looked at him, her expression calm, her spirit finally, blessedly, her own. Mr. Abernathy rose from his desk, a silent signal that the meeting was over. Liam, Daniel, he said, his voice now devoid of any emotion. I will have my assistant show you out. It was a dismissal, absolute and final. Liam looked as if he wanted to say more, to scream, to smash something. His fists were clenched and a vein throbbed in his temple. But the lawyer's calm, unassailable authority seemed to have finally broken through his rage. He shot Eleanor a look of pure venom, a silent promise of future battles, before turning on his heel and storming out of the office without another word. Daniel followed, more slowly. His shoulders slumped in defeat. He didn't look at Eleanor. He couldn't. His final parting shot had been to throw the word alone at her as an insult, and in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. He had made himself a stranger to her, and the weight of that realization was written all over his face. Eleanor remained seated for a moment after they were gone, the silence in the room now feeling light and clean. She looked at Mr. Abernathy, who was watching her with an expression of paternal concern. Are you all right, Eleanor? He asked gently. She nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was true. I think so, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. It's a lot to take in. Thomas knew it would be, the lawyer said. He walked around the desk and handed her the thick blue-ribboned document. He trusted you. He believed in you. Don't ever doubt that. Clutching the will to her chest like a shield, Eleanor stood up. She thanked him, the words feeling inadequate for the tectonic shift he had just presided over in her life. As she walked out of the office and into the bright, indifferent sunshine, the world felt strange, alien. The sounds of the city, the distant sirens, the hum of traffic, the chatter of passers-by, seemed both muted and hyper-clear. It was as if she had been living her life underwater and had only just broken the surface for a gasp of fresh air. She didn't go straight home. Instead, she drove to the small park overlooking the river, a place her father had loved. She sat on a bench, the legal document heavy in her lap, and watched the water flow by, endless and patient. The shock was beginning to recede, and in its place, a complex tapestry of emotions was weaving itself together. There was grief, still fresh and raw, for the father she had lost, but it was now intertwined with an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the father she had found again in that video, the man who saw her, knew her, and loved her enough to orchestrate this painful, beautiful, final act of protection. There was anger, too, a quiet, slow-burning anger at her brothers, Their mockery in the lawyer's office had been the final, ugly nail in the coffin of their relationship. Daniel's parting words, "Money can't buy a family," echoed in her mind. He was right, but for the wrong reasons. A family was something you built through love, respect, and presence. He and Liam had let their foundation crumble long ago. They had wanted the inheritance of a family without putting in the work of being one. After an hour of watching the river, she finally felt ready to go to the house. Her house. The words still felt foreign. As she pulled into the driveway, she saw it differently. It wasn't just the backdrop to her father's illness or the monument to her own suspended life. It was a haven, a fortress. It was hers. Inside, the air was still and held the faint, familiar scent of her father's favorite pipe tobacco and the antiseptic smell of his medications. For years, the house had felt like a hospital, a place of hushed tones and careful movements. Eleanor walked into the living room, where the heavy velvet curtains were always kept drawn to keep the light from hurting her father's sensitive eyes. On impulse, she walked to the main window, grabbed the thick cord, and pulled. The curtains slid open with a heavy whoosh, and the room was flooded with the golden light of the late afternoon. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams like tiny, joyful sprites. The light illuminated everything, chasing the shadows from the corners and making the rich colors of the old furniture seem to wake from a long slumber. It was such a simple act, yet it felt monumental. It was the first decision she had made in this house that was entirely for herself. She moved through the rooms, her home, yet a place she was seeing for the first time. In the kitchen, she opened the pantry, not to check on medication schedules or ensure supplies, but just to see what was there. In her father's study, she ran her hand over his worn leather armchair, not with a sense of duty, but with a sense of connection. It was there, on his desk, that she found one last surprise. Tucked beneath his old, ink-stained blotter was a single envelope with her name on it, written in his familiar, spidery script. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was not a long letter, but a short, simple note. It read, "My Eleanor, I hope by now you understand. Forgive an old man his theatrics. Your brothers are good men at heart, I believe, but they have lost their way. I pray one day they find it. But you never lost yours. You were my compass. Now the world is yours. Don't you dare live a small life. Go be happy. You are so, so loved. Dad." The last of her composure crumbled. The tears she had held back in the lawyer's office, in the car, at the park, finally came. They were not tears of sadness or humiliation, but of release, a deep, cleansing catharsis. She wept for the father she had lost, for the brothers who had lost their way, and for the woman she had been, the one who had felt invisible for so long. When the tears subsided, a profound sense of peace settled over her. She stood up and walked to the back door, stepping out into the garden her father had so loved. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and blooming roses. She looked back at the house now glowing in the twilight, a beacon of warmth and safety. Her brothers were wrong. She wasn't alone. She was surrounded by the enduring, unshakable love of her father, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt free. 1 year later, the scent of salt and sea spray had replaced the stale air of a sick room. Eleanor stood on the balcony of a small cottage overlooking the Pacific Ocean, a place she had only ever seen in magazines. The house at 212 Oak Street had been sold. She had kept a few precious items, her father's leather armchair, his collection of worn poetry books, and the framed photo of his first humble office. They were anchors to her past, but not chains. The bulk of the inheritance, after the legal challenges from her brothers had been swiftly and decisively dismissed by the courts, was being put to work. Liam and Daniel had tried to contest the will, just as they had threatened. They'd claimed their father was mentally incompetent, that Eleanor had exerted undue influence. But the video, coupled with Mr. Abernathy's meticulous documentation and testimony from Thomas's doctors, rendered their case hopeless. It had cost them a small fortune in legal fees, a bitter irony that was not lost on Eleanor. She hadn't heard from them since the court's final ruling. There were no angry phone calls, no pleading letters, just a vast echoing silence. She had grieved the loss of her brothers not as they were, but as they might have been. She held on to her father's hope that they might one day find their way, but she knew that journey was theirs to make alone. Her father's note, "Don't you dare live a small life," had become her mantra. She had spent 6 months traveling, not to lavish resorts, but to quiet, beautiful corners of the world her father had always dreamed of seeing. She walked through ancient forests in Japan, sketched ruins in Greece, and learned to cook from a smiling grandmother in a small Italian village. For the first time, her days were her own, measured not in medication schedules, but in sunrises and new experiences. But her greatest project was the Thomas Albright Foundation for Family Caregivers. Using a significant portion of the estate, she had created a charitable organization that provided grants, respite care, and support networks for people who had put their lives on hold to care for a loved one. It was her way of honoring her father's true legacy, turning her quiet, personal sacrifice into a public chorus of support for the thousands of other invisible Eleanors in the world. Her work gave her a purpose that felt more real and lasting than any stock portfolio. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, Eleanor smiled. She was no longer the timid, overshadowed woman who had sat in the lawyer's office, bracing for humiliation. She was calm, confident, and deeply at peace. The memory of her brother's mockery had faded, its power dissolved by a year of living a full and authentic life. The emptiness inside her had been filled, not with wealth, but with purpose and gratitude. Her father's love had been the key that unlocked her cage. He hadn't just left her his money, he had left her a second chance at life, a final, profound gift that she intended to honor every single day. She was not and had never truly been alone.